It's 7 a.m. in the pristine, sun-drenched neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates. Manicured lawns, multi-million-dollar homes, the picture of suburban tranquility. Until it isn't. A black woman, athletic gear on, lost in the rhythm of her morning. Jog feels the familiar chill of flashing blue lights behind her. A police cruiser pulls alongside, an officer emerging with suspicion etched onto his face. He thinks she doesn't belong here. He thinks she's an outsider, a potential threat in his pristine neighborhood. He questions her, demands ID, humiliates her under the watchful eyes of her neighbors. What this officer, dripping with prejudice, doesn't realize is that the perfectly trimmed grass he's standing on, the sprawling mansion behind him, the very air he's breathing in this exclusive enclave, it all belongs to her. He just detained the owner of the estate, and his world is about to unravel, live on his own Bodycam. Stick around because the fallout is something you won't want to miss. And hey, let us know where you're tuning in. From today, drop your city or state in the comments below, as we love seeing our community. The first blush of dawn painted the meticulously sculpted clouds above Willow Creek Estates in hues of soft rose and pale gold. It was 7 a.m., an hour when the neighborhood existed in a state of suspended animation, the quiet hum of exorbitant sprinkler systems the only dominant sound breaking the stillness. This was a place engineered for tranquility, a bastion of manicured perfection where even the blades of grass seemed to stand at disciplined attention. Spanish moss dripped like lace from ancient oak trees, filtering the nascent sunlight onto sprawling lawns that rolled seamlessly towards imposing front doors of mahogany and glass. The air itself felt different here, cleaner, perfumed with the expensive scents of night-blooming jasmine, giving way to the damp earthiness of awakening rose gardens and the faint, clean tang of chlorine from unseen backyard pools. This was the carefully curated serenity Dr. Evelyn Reed had relentlessly pursued, a stark counterpoint to the controlled chaos of the pediatric cardiac unit she commanded. Evelyn moved through this landscape like a phantom, her breath a steady, controlled rhythm against the backdrop of awakening nature. Her feet, clad in the latest high-performance running shoes, a small indulgence she allowed herself, struck the smooth asphalt of Magnolia Lane with a soft, percussive beat. This wasn't just exercise. It was a pilgrimage, a daily reclaiming of self before the immense weight of responsibility settled upon her shoulders. Each stride was a release, shedding the lingering tension from yesterday's complex surgeries, the anxieties over fragile young lives hanging in the balance, the endless administrative battles. Here, for this precious hour, she wasn't Dr. Reed, the renowned surgeon who'd shattered glass ceilings and expectations. She was just Evelyn, a woman seeking solace in motion and the simple act of breathing the cool morning air. She rounded a gentle curve, the massive Tudor revival on the corner, giving way to a sleek modern marvel of glass and steel, her home. Number 42. Even after 3 years, a faint thrill, a sense of quiet disbelief, often ran through her when she saw it. It wasn't just the structure itself, though its architectural beauty was undeniable. It was what it represented. The culmination of decades of grueling work, sleepless nights fueled by caffeine and ambition, navigating worlds, academic, medical, social, that often felt designed to exclude her. She remembered the subtle and sometimes not so subtle surprise on colleagues' faces when she'd first mentioned moving to Willow Creek, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. This house, this address, was more than shelter. It was a statement, hard-earned and fiercely protected. Her mind drifted, as it often did on these runs, weaving through the tapestry of her life. The scholarship kid from the rough side of town, devouring textbooks while her friends partied. The only black woman in her surgical residency cohort, enduring the isolation and the constant pressure to be twice as good to be considered half as equal. The mentors who believed in her, the doubters who fueled her determination. The tiny heartbeats she'd coaxed back to life under the harsh glare of operating room lights. Each memory, each challenge overcome, was embedded in the very foundation of the life she now lived, a life symbolized by the quiet privilege of jogging undisturbed through these opulent streets. Ahead, old Mr. Henderson, a retired judge with tea, A shock of white hair was already meticulously tending his award-winning roses, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up as she approached, offering his customary brief nod and tight-lipped smile. Evelyn returned the nod, their silent acknowledgement a small stitch in the fabric of neighborhood routine. She saw Mrs. Gable's pristine white SUV backing, slowly out of her driveway, likely heading for an early tennis match at the club. These small, predictable rituals reinforced the sense of order, of safety, that Willow Creek projected. It was a carefully constructed illusion, perhaps, but one Evelyn desperately needed to believe in during these stolen moments of peace. The scent of freshly cut grass intensified as she passed a lawn crew already at work on the Harrison estate, their powerful mowers humming in the distance. She picked up her pace slightly, feeling the satisfying burn in her thighs, the endorphins beginning to flood her system, clearing the last vestiges of sleep from her mind. The world felt sharp, immediate, the precise geometric patterns of the cobblestone edging along the driveways, the iridescent shimmer of dew on a spiderweb spun between hedges, the cool caress of a gentle breeze against her damp skin. This clarity, this connection to the physical moment, was the gift of the run. It centered her, grounded her, prepared her for the demands of the day. She was lost in that rhythm, in the simple joy of movement and the beauty of the morning, her thoughts turning towards the complex valve replacement surgery scheduled for 10 a.m. The familiar route unfurled before her, each turn, each tree a known quantity. She allowed herself a small internal smile. It was a good morning, a peaceful morning. She was approaching the final stretch back towards her own driveway, the magnificent silhouette of her home coming fully into view. Then the peace shattered. Not with a sound initially, but with a sudden jarring intrusion of light. Flashing red and blue strobed violently against the tranquil green lawns and pale stucco walls reflected in the mirrored windows of the houses. The discordant colors ripped through the serene morning palette, an immediate signal of disruption, of something fundamentally wrong. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her pace faltered. Her head snapped up, eyes searching for the source. A police cruiser, stark white and official, had materialized as if from nowhere. It hadn't just pulled alongside. It had deliberately angled across the road, blocking her path completely, its lights painting the asphalt in urgent, alarming strokes. The quiet sanctuary of Willow Creek Estates had just been violated, and instinctively, chillingly, Evelyn knew that violation was aimed directly at her. The cruiser door opened with a decisive click that echoed unnaturally in the morning stillness. Officer Miller unfolded himself from the driver's seat, not with the measured caution of an officer responding to a genuine threat, but with a proprietary swagger, as if stepping onto territory he owned and was duty-bound to patrol against perceived impurities. He wasn't overly tall, but his stocky build, amplified by the crisp uniform and the bulk of the utility belt cinched tight around his waist, gave him an imposing presence. His movements were deliberate, almost leisurely, yet underpinned by an undeniable air of authority, an authority he seemed eager to wield. He adjusted his belt, his hand lingering near the butt of his sidearm for a fraction longer than necessary, a subtle, perhaps unconscious display of power. His eyes, the color of faded denim and narrowed against the gentle sunlight, fixed on Evelyn with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't the look of someone assessing a situation, it was the look of someone who had already reached a conclusion and was merely gathering the formalities. "Hold up there," he called out. The command wasn't shouted, but it carried a sharp, peremptory edge that sliced through the tranquil birdsong and the distant hum of lawnmowers. It was unnecessarily loud, designed to halt, to assert dominance before any interaction had even begun. Evelyn, jolted from her mental preparation for the day's surgery, slowed her jog, her heart rate spiking instantly, a purely physiological response to the unexpected confrontation, the flashing lights, the uniform. Years of navigating similar, though usually less overt encounters had honed her instincts. She pulled the white earbuds from her ears, letting them dangle against her collarbone, the sudden silence amplifying the tension. She turned fully to face him, adopting a posture of careful neutrality, back straight, hands relaxed at her, sides expression calm. It was a mask she wore well practiced and necessary, hiding the immediate flare of indignation and the weary sigh that threatened to escape her. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, pitched at a normal conversational volume, a deliberate counterpoint to his authoritative tone. She kept her gaze level with his, refusing to be intimidated, though the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She knew this script, or variations of it, all too well. Officer Miller didn't answer immediately. He took a few slow steps towards her, his boots crunching softly on the pristine asphalt. His eyes performed a deliberate, insolent scan, starting at her running shoes, traveling up her toned legs visible beneath her Lululemon shorts, lingering for a moment on her simple, dry-fit tank top damp with perspiration before finally meeting her eyes again. Then his gaze flickered pointedly towards the opulent mansions lining Magnolia Lane, their grand facades reflecting the morning sun like impassive, wealthy sentinels. The implication was crystal clear. "You. Here? It doesn't add up." "This is a private neighborhood, ma'am," he stated finally. The ma'am, a flimsy veneer of politeness stretched taut over a core of suspicion. His tone suggested he was imparting classified information she couldn't possibly possess. "Very exclusive. We've had some reports lately. Suspicious activity. People casing properties. Suspicious activity." The euphemism landed with the subtlety of a brick. It was the all-purpose justification, the shield behind which bias often hid. Evelyn felt a familiar wave of exhaustion wash over her. How many times did she have to justify her mere existence in spaces she had earned the right to occupy? "I understand it's private, officer," she replied, keeping her voice meticulously even. "I live here. My house is just down the street, actually." She made a small, vague gesture further along the lane, resisting the urge to point directly at her own magnificent home just yet. To do so felt like pleading, like needing to prove her legitimacy, a position she fundamentally rejected. A smirk, small but sharp, touched the corners of Officer Miller's lips. It was a smirk of disbelief, of condescending amusement. "Right," he said, drawing the word out slightly, imbuing it with skepticism. "Well, even so, things being what they are, I'm going to need to see some identification." The demand hung in the air, deliberately unreasonable. "Officer," Evelyn stated, the edge of impatience now subtly fraying her composure. "As you can see, I'm jogging. I don't carry my wallet or driver's license when I run through my own neighborhood. I have nothing on me but my house key fob and my earbuds." His smirk widened, revealing a hint of satisfaction, as if her lack of ID confirmed his initial suspicions. "Well, isn't that convenient?" he retorted, the sarcasm undisguised. He closed the remaining distance between them, stepping firmly into her personal space. The sudden proximity was jarring, aggressive. He was close enough now that she could see the small scar above his eyebrow, smell the faint scent of stale coffee and standard-issue fabric cleaner. She instinctively took a half-step back, needing to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact, a physical manifestation of the power imbalance he was actively cultivating. "Look," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming conspiratorial, almost patronizing. "You understand how it looks, right? From our perspective, someone like you wandering around here this early in the morning, nothing in your hands, looking around. Folks get nervous, they call us, we have to check it out. Someone like you." There it was again. Not just someone, but someone like you. The phrase was loaded, freighted with centuries of prejudice, stereotypes, and the dangerous assumption that blackness in proximity to wealth equated to inherent suspicion. It wasn't just an observation, it was an accusation embedded in casual language. It implied she was an anomaly, an intrusion, a potential threat defined solely by her race in this environment. The injustice of it burned, hot and sharp, behind her carefully neutral expression. She saw, from the corner of her eye, Mrs. Gables, silhouette frozen behind her sheer window curtains. Mr. Henderson had stopped fussing with his roses entirely now, his posture stiffening, his gaze fixed on the unfolding drama. The public spectacle amplified the sting of the officer's words, turning a personal indignity into a communal judgment. Officer Miller seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened by the audience, basking in the perceived righteousness of his vigilance, utterly convinced he had caught someone who didn't belong. Someone like you. The phrase echoed in the suddenly cavernous space of Evelyn's mind, ricocheting off years of similar microaggressions and outright hostilities. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the casual, almost unconscious way Officer Miller deployed them, as if stating an obvious, immutable fact. Someone like you, meaning someone black, someone whose very presence in this manicured sanctuary of wealth and whiteness defied his deeply ingrained expectations, his narrow worldview. It conjured ghosts of past encounters, the store clerk following her too closely through designer boutiques, the maitre d' assuming she was waitstaff, the academic rival questioning her research credentials with thinly veiled condescension. Each instance was a tiny pinprick, seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively forming a tapestry of wearying bias she navigated daily. Here on her own street, bathed in the soft morning light she cherished, the phrase felt particularly violative, stripping away the earned comfort of her surroundings and reducing her once again to a suspicious anomaly. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a physical manifestation of the anger and frustration simmering beneath her carefully controlled surface. It wasn't just the injustice, it was the sheer predictability of it all. How many times had she rehearsed these scenarios mentally, coached, herself on the exact tone to strike, calm but firm, non-threatening but not subservient? How many times had she swallowed the sharp retort, the demand for his badge number, opting instead for de-escalation, knowing that any display of anger, however justified, could be twisted and used against her? It was an exhausting, soul-crushing performance, demanded simply because the color of her skin in certain zip codes triggered suspicion. Officer Miller, misinterpreting her controlled silence as acquiescence, or perhaps even guilt, seemed to puff up slightly, his confidence visibly growing. He shifted his weight, planting his feet more firmly on the asphalt, a subtle claiming of the space. His eyes, which had held a flicker of procedural caution moments before, now gleamed with the self-assurance of someone convinced they were right, someone performing a necessary, if unpleasant, duty. He likely saw her composure not as practiced discipline, but as suspicious guardedness. So, he continued, leaning in again, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a harsh truth for her own good. No ID. Out here. First thing in the morning. In this neighborhood. You got to admit it doesn't look good. Puts people on edge. He gestured vaguely towards the surrounding houses, implying a shared anxiety among the unseen residents, positioning himself as their protector against her. Against the vague, undefined threat her presence supposedly represented. Evelyn resisted the powerful urge to sigh, to roll her eyes, to point out the absurdity. Did joggers normally carry photo identification? Did white joggers in Willow Creek Estates get stopped and questioned about looking suspicious? The questions screamed in her mind, but she bit them back. "Officer," she said, striving to keep her voice even, "I understand your concern for the neighborhood's safety. However, I assure you, I pose no threat. I am simply a resident completing my morning run." Her assertion seemed to bounce harmlessly off his certainty. "Yeah, you said that," he countered, his tone dismissive. He tapped his utility belt thoughtfully. "Thing is, talk is cheap. Without ID, how do I know who you are? How do I know you're not giving me a story? We get all kinds trying to blend in around here." He delivered the line with a knowing look, as if letting her in on a secret about the criminal element constantly, trying to infiltrate this paradise. The implication was clear. She fit the profile of all kinds. The humiliation intensified, amplified by the awareness of being watched. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Gable's stare from behind the pristine window panes, could sense Mr. Henderson's troubled gaze fixed upon them. Were they judging her too? Wondering if the officer's suspicions were valid, or were they judging him, recognizing the blatant profiling for what it was? Regardless, their presence transformed the interaction from a private indignity into a public spectacle. She felt exposed, pinned like a specimen under the twin lenses of official suspicion and neighborhood curiosity. The carefully constructed anonymity of her morning routine, the sense of being just another resident enjoying the quiet streets, evaporated under the harsh glare of this unwanted attention. She needed to regain control, to shift the narrative he was so confidently writing. Her mind raced, evaluating options. Argue further? Demand his supervisor? Refuse to cooperate? Each path carried risks. Arguing could escalate the situation, potentially leading to a baseless arrest for obstruction. Demanding a supervisor might work eventually, but it would prolong the humiliation, keep her standing here, exposed and accused. Refusing to cooperate was unthinkable, feeding directly into his narrative of suspicious behavior. Officer Miller seemed to interpret her brief silence, her internal calculation, as further confirmation of his assessment. He straightened up, adopting a more official posture. "All right," he declared, his voice taking on a new firmness. "Since you can't provide identification and you're in an area with recent reports, I'm going to have to detain you for further investigation. Stay right here. Don't move." He reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button, ready to broadcast her description. Black female, athletic wear, suspicious, detained on Magnolia Lane. The words formed in Evelyn's mind, stark and damning. This couldn't happen, not here, not now. The time for patient explanation for polite endurance was over. His hand moved towards the radio. Action was required. Now. Officer Miller's thumb hovered, a fraction of an inch above the transmit button on his shoulder microphone. The plastic casing felt cool and solid beneath his touch, a tangible symbol of his authority, his connection to the network of law enforcement that validated his actions. He cleared his throat, preparing to speak the practiced, clipped language of dispatch. Unit 7 requesting backup and running a description. Magnolia Lane, suspicious person, black female, approx 5'7", athletic build, dark clothing, refusing. To provide ID, the words formed in his mind, ready to spill into the airwaves, to solidify Evelyn's status from resident jogger to official police subject. He felt a surge of righteous confidence. He was doing his job, protecting the neighborhood, handling a situation that didn't feel right. His instincts, honed by years on the force, or perhaps years of unchecked bias, told him he was onto something. For Evelyn, watching that thumb poised for action was like watching a timer count down to an explosion. Each millisecond stretched, thick with dread and a rising tide of fury. This was the precipice. Once those words were spoken, once her description was broadcast as a suspicious person, the narrative would be set in official stone. It would become part of a record, a digital footprint potentially following her, justifying future stops, future suspicions. The humiliation, currently confined to this small stretch of pavement and the watchful eyes of her neighbors, would become systemic, official. The image of herself, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a respected surgeon, a homeowner in this very neighborhood, being reduced to a faceless, raceless, yet implicitly racialized description of potential criminality, it was intolerable. Enough. The word resonated deep within her, a silent detonation that shattered the dam of her carefully constructed composure. The years of swallowing indignities, of choosing de-escalation over confrontation, of performing respectability in the face of disrespect, it all crumbled in that instant. The exhaustion of it, the sheer unfairness, coalesced into a hard, bright point of resolve. Why should she be the one managing his prejudice? Why should she bear the burden of proving her innocence simply for existing in her own space? The deference she had shown him hadn't earned respect. It had only emboldened his arrogance, confirmed his assumptions. Politeness had failed, logic had failed. Now, only the unvarnished truth remained. A profound shift occurred within her, subtle yet total. It was the same focused clarity that descended upon her in the operating room when facing a critical moment, when hesitation was not an option, when decisive action was required to avert disaster. The ambient noise of the morning, the distant mowers, the chirping birds, even the low hum of the police cruiser's engine, seemed to recede. Her focus narrowed, sharpening entirely onto Officer Miller and the imminent act of broadcasting. That false narrative. The fear, the anxiety, the simmering anger, they didn't vanish, but they transformed, channeled into a cold, potent determination. She drew herself up, not aggressively, but with an undeniable straightening of her spine, a subtle lift of her chin. Her shoulders, previously held in a posture of non-confrontational neutrality, squared slightly. Her gaze, which had been carefully modulated to appear calm and reasonable, now held a new intensity, direct, unwavering, and radiating an authority that had nothing to do with a uniform or a badge. It was the innate authority of someone who knew exactly who she was, where she stood, and the injustice being perpetrated against her. She took one slow, deliberate breath, centering herself, just as Miller's lips parted, ready to speak into the microphone. Evelyn acted. "Officer Miller," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with arresting clarity. It was deeper than before, resonant, carrying the unmistakable timbre of command she used when addressing surgical teams or lecturing medical students. The sound of his own name, spoken with such unexpected force and precision, startled him. His thumb froze inches from the button. His head snapped towards her, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation at being interrupted mid-procedure. He clearly hadn't expected her to speak again, certainly not like this. She held his startled gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to look away. She let the silence hang for a beat, allowing the unexpected interruption to register fully, disrupting his momentum, seizing the conversational initiative. The power dynamic, which he had so confidently controlled moments before, tilted perceptibly. He was no longer solely the interrogator. He was now being directly addressed, challenged by the subject of his suspicion. Mr. Henderson, still standing nearby, shifted his weight, his expression hardening with anticipation. Even Mrs. Gable seemed to lean closer to her window pane. Evelyn continued, her words measured, deliberate, each syllable carrying weight. "Before you proceed," she paused again, letting the conditional phrase sink in, emphasizing that his intended action was not yet complete, perhaps not inevitable, with broadcasting my description as a suspect. She deliberately used his implicit framing, turning it back on him, and potentially escalating this situation based on unfounded assumptions, another direct challenge to his judgment. "Perhaps," she concluded, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity, "you should take a more careful look at exactly where you are standing." The sentence landed in the quiet, morning air not as a suggestion, but as a directive wrapped in polite language. It was unexpected, slightly cryptic, and utterly arresting. It shifted the focus from her identity to his physical location, hinting at a crucial piece of information he had overlooked, a context he had completely failed to grasp. It was the verbal equivalent of a surgeon pointing out a critical missed detail on an X-ray just before an incision is made. It stopped him cold, confusion warring with ingrained authority on his face, forcing him finally to pause and reconsider the ground beneath his feet. The stage was set for the revelation that would unravel his entire prejudiced premise. Officer Miller stared at Evelyn, momentarily thrown off balance by the sheer unexpectedness of her directive. Her words, "Perhaps you should take a more careful look at exactly where you are standing," hung in the air, charged with an enigmatic weight. His brow furrowed, suspicion momentarily giving way to genuine confusion. What did his location have to do with anything? He was on Magnolia Lane, in Willow Creek Estates, performing his duty. He instinctively glanced down at his own polished boots planted firmly on the plush, impeccably maintained zoysia grass bordering the asphalt. It was just grass. Expensive grass, yes, typical of the neighborhood, but still just grass. He looked back up at Evelyn, a flicker of annoyance returning to his eyes. Was this some kind of trick, a delaying tactic, a desperate attempt to deflect from her lack of identification? "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice regaining some of its gruffness, though tinged now with a note of uncertainty he couldn't quite conceal. He shifted his stance slightly, trying to reassert his physical dominance, but the unexpected turn in the conversation had subtly undermined his confidence. He felt a prickle of unease, a vague sense that the script he'd been following was suddenly veering off course. Evelyn didn't reply immediately. She simply held his gaze, allowing his confusion to deepen, letting the implication of her words settle. Her expression remained composed, But there was a new intensity in her eyes, a glint of steely resolve that hadn't been there before. The mask of polite deference had dissolved, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone holding an undeniable trump card. Then slowly, deliberately, she spoke again, her voice clear and precise, each word landing with calculated impact. "You're standing," she repeated, emphasizing the location. "On my front lawn." The statement hung in the air, stark and seemingly improbable. Miller blinked. His mind struggled to process the information. Her front lawn? He glanced again at the vast expanse of emerald green stretching from the curb towards the imposing structure behind him. It was part of the property, undeniably. But hers? He looked back at Evelyn, at her simple running attire, her sweat-dampened hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, and the cognitive dissonance was palpable. His internal stereotypes, the ingrained assumptions about who lived in houses like these, clashed violently with the reality standing before him. Before he could formulate a skeptical response, Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. She tilted her head slightly, directing his gaze and implicitly the gaze of their small audience towards the architectural marvel looming just yards away. "That house," she declared, pointing directly now, a simple declarative gesture, that held immense power. "Number 42 Magnolia Lane, the one with the infinity pool you can just glimpse over the hedge, the one featured in Architectural Digest last spring. That is my residence. My name," she added, delivering the final piece with quiet finality, "is Dr. Evelyn Reed. Dr. Evelyn Reed." The name, coupled with the specific mention of the house number and the magazine feature, landed like a series of sonic booms in the quiet. Morning air. Miller's jaw literally went slack. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating slightly in shock. The confident smirk he'd worn just moments ago vanished completely, replaced by a look of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. You live there?" The words tumbled out, barely a whisper, stripped of all authority, laden only with stunned confusion. It wasn't just a question. It was an involuntary expression of his shattered worldview. The woman he had profiled, harassed, and was about to officially detain as a potential criminal was, according to her claim, the owner of one of the most prestigious properties in the entire neighborhood. Evelyn didn't need to verbally confirm again. The truth, once spoken, resonated with its own undeniable power, but she offered one final irrefutable piece of evidence. With the same deliberate calm she'd displayed throughout the encounter, she reached into the small, discreet pouch clipped securely to the waistband of her running shorts. Miller tensed reflexively. Years of training, screaming potential threat, potential weapon. His hand twitched near his sidearm, but Evelyn ignored his reaction. She slowly withdrew not a weapon, not an ID card, but a small, sleek electronic fob, the kind used for high-end security systems and automated gates. Holding it up briefly, ensuring he and Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Gable behind her blinds could see it clearly, she pressed a small, discreet button on its surface. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A soft, expensive-sounding hydraulic hiss broke the tense silence. From the imposing stone pillars flanking the entrance to the circular driveway, the massive, ornate wrought-iron gates, symbols of privacy, exclusivity, and wealth, began to glide smoothly, silently open. They moved with a quiet grace that bespoke sophisticated engineering and significant expense, revealing the meticulously paved driveway leading towards the house's grand entrance. The sight of those gates opening at her command was the final, irrefutable punctuation mark. It was visual, undeniable proof that transcended words, that obliterated Miller's assumptions in a single, elegant motion. It confirmed her identity, her residency, her belonging in a way no driver's license ever could. The power dynamic didn't just tilt, it inverted completely, crashing down upon Officer Miller with the weight of his own staggering misjudgment. The ground, quite literally, had been pulled out from under him. He stood frozen on her lawn, witness to her access, his entire prejudiced premise exposed as a house of cards collapsing in the quiet morning sun. The silently gliding wrought-iron gates were more eloquent than any argument Evelyn could have made. They were a physical manifestation of her belonging, a tangible rebuke to Officer Miller's unfounded suspicions. The soft hydraulic hiss seemed to echo in the suddenly profound silence, magnifying the weight of the moment. Miller stood utterly frozen on the immaculate grass, her grass, his face a mask of stunned disbelief rapidly morphing into dawning horror. The rich green beneath his boots suddenly felt like burning coals. He wasn't just wrong. He was spectacularly, publicly, career-threateningly wrong. His mind raced, scrambling to reconcile the image of the woman he'd been harassing with the undeniable reality of her commanding access to this multi-million-dollar estate, Dr. Evelyn Reed. The name echoed in his skull. He'd heard it before, hadn't he? Maybe in the local paper. Something about a prestigious award from the hospital, or perhaps mentioned by his wife in relation to a colleague's child needing a specialist. The fragments of recognition were hazy, obscured by the fog of his own prejudice, but they added another layer to the sickening realization curdling in his stomach. He hadn't just stopped a random jogger, he had potentially harassed one of the city's prominent medical figures. He darted a frantic, almost panicked glance towards the elegant house number, 42, affixed near the grand entryway, as if verifying the impossible. Then his gaze snapped back to Evelyn's composed face, searching for, what? A sign that this was a trick? A misunderstanding? But her expression offered no such comfort. It was calm, yes, but beneath the surface lay a current of cold, righteous anger, the look of someone whose patience had been exhausted and whose resolve had solidified into steel. He looked again at the silently opening gates, now wide enough to admit a vehicle, an irrefutable symbol of her rightful place. The carefully constructed edifice of his authority, built on assumptions and bias, crumbled around him. Just as Miller seemed about to stammer out some form of incoherent apology or desperate justification, a new voice entered the charged atmosphere, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Everything all right here, Evelyn?" It was Mr. Henderson. The retired judge, abandoning his roses entirely now, was walking briskly towards them, his posture radiating protective concern, his gardening shears still clutched firmly in one hand, like an unlikely scepter of neighborhood authority. His familiar use of Evelyn's first name, delivered with the easy confidence of long-standing neighborly acquaintance, landed like another blow against Miller's already staggering confidence. It instantly established Evelyn not as an outsider, but as an integrated, respected member of this community, the very community Miller supposedly represented and protected. Miller visibly flinched at the intervention, his head swiveling towards the approaching older man. He looked cornered, trapped between the undeniable evidence of Evelyn's status and the disapproving gaze of a clearly influential neighbor. The color continued to drain from his face, leaving it pasty and clammy-looking beneath his regulation haircut. "This officer giving you trouble?" Mr. Henderson pressed, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in Miller's obvious discomposure and Evelyn's tense stance. Before Miller could formulate a response, Evelyn replied, her voice cool and steady, her gaze still fixed unwaveringly on the officer. "It appears Officer Miller had some concerns about my presence in the neighborhood, George," she said, deliberately understating the situation while subtly highlighting the absurdity. The use of Mr. Henderson's first name further cemented her position within the local social fabric. She then shifted her focus entirely onto Miller, her tone hardening, transitioning seamlessly from neighborhood resident to aggrieved citizen demanding official accountability. "Officer," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument, "I will need your badge number now, and the name of your direct supervising officer." She paused, letting the demand hang heavy in the air before adding the crucial element, "I trust your Bodycam has been recording this entire interaction?" The mention of the Bodycam seemed to land like a physical jolt. Miller's eyes widened. Slightly further, a flicker of sheer panic crossing his features. The camera, mandated by department policy, was indeed rolling. Every word he'd spoken, every smirk, every condescending remark, his baseless accusations, his refusal to accept her initial explanation, and now his utter disintegration upon being proven wrong. It was all captured, documented in high-definition video and audio. His own technology, meant to ensure transparency and accountability, was now his chief accuser. There would be no denying his actions, No rewriting the narrative. Later. His hand trembled visibly as he fumbled for the small memo book tucked into his shirt pocket. The arrogant swagger he'd projected just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, clumsy movements of someone desperate to comply, desperate to somehow mitigate the disaster he had created. I apologize, ma'am. Doctor, he stammered, the words tripping over themselves. He couldn't quite meet her eyes, his gaze darting nervously between her, Mr. Henderson, and the silently watching house. I didn't realize. It was a mistake. Misunderstanding. The excuses sounded feeble, pathetic even to his own ears. The carefully constructed wall of his authority had not just been breached, it had been utterly demolished, leaving him exposed and floundering in the wreckage of his own prejudice. The reckoning had begun, live on camera, on Dr. Evelyn Reed's immaculate front lawn. Officer Miller's stammered apologies, laced with the desperation of a man watching his career flash before his eyes, did nothing to quell the cold fire burning in Evelyn's chest. His mistake, his misunderstanding, wasn't an accidental wrong. Turn on a map. It was a fundamental failure of judgment, a willful blindness fueled by prejudice. It was the assumption that her black skin automatically rendered her suspicious, an outsider, unworthy of the benefit of the doubt in this affluent space. His regret now stemmed not from a genuine recognition of his bias, but from the dawning realization of the consequences. The complaint, the bodycam footage, the influential witness standing beside her. His apology felt hollow, self-serving, offered only when his power had evaporated and his position became untenable. No, officer, Evelyn cut through his fumbling excuses, her voice sharp and precise, echoing the clean incisions she made in the operating room. There was no heat in her tone, only an icy clarity that was far more unnerving. It wasn't a mistake. Calling dispatch for backup when you see a genuine crime in progress might be a mistake if your assessment is wrong. This, she emphasized, locking eyes with him, forcing him to meet her gaze, was a choice. You chose to profile me based on my race. You chose to dismiss my explanation that I lived here. You chose to escalate the situation by detaining me without cause. You chose to humiliate me in front of my neighbors on my own property. That cascade of choices isn't a misunderstanding, Officer Miller. It's textbook bias-based policing. Each point landed like a precisely aimed dart, dismantling his weak attempts at justification. Miller flinched visibly under the barrage, his face flushing now, a mixture of shame and defensive anger warring beneath the surface pallor. He opened his mouth as if to argue, perhaps to cite procedure or policy, but seemed to think better of it. He knew deep down that she was right. The bodycam footage would show his intent, his assumptions, his dismissal of her claims long before any real investigation occurred. His hand trembled more noticeably now as he finally managed to extract his memo book and pen. He avoided looking directly at Evelyn or Mr. Henderson, keeping his eyes fixed on the small notepad as he recited his badge number, 714, and the name of his shift supervisor, Sergeant Riley, his voice barely audible, stripped of all its earlier confidence. He sounded defeated, deflated. Evelyn meticulously jotted down the information on a mental notepad, committing it to memory with the same focus she applied to patient charts. She made a point of repeating the badge number aloud, 714, ensuring it was clearly audible for the bodycam microphone, locking it into the official record. She then took a half-step back, subtly reclaiming the space he had invaded earlier, a small but significant reclaiming of her physical autonomy. The silence stretched for a moment, heavy and awkward. Miller stood there, memo book still in hand, looking utterly lost, unsure of the protocol for retreating from a self-inflicted disaster. He glanced towards his cruiser, then back at Evelyn, as if seeking permission to leave, a stark reversal of the authority he had projected just minutes before. Evelyn offered him no such comfort. "You may leave now, officer," she said, her tone coolly dismissive. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order delivered with the quiet authority of someone firmly back in control of her own space. The interaction was over, terminated on her terms. He didn't need telling twice. Relief washed over his features, quickly followed by a renewed wave of humiliation at having been so thoroughly dismantled and dismissed. Muttering another incoherent fragment of an apology towards the ground, he turned abruptly and practically scurried back towards his patrol car. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, lacking the earlier purposeful stride. He fumbled slightly with the car door handle before pulling it open and sliding inside, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He spoke urgently into his radio, the words muffled by the closed window, but the tone clearly communicating distress or cancellation of his earlier intent. Then, with a brief chirp of tires on the pristine asphalt, a sound utterly out of place in the tranquil neighborhood, he pulled away from the curb, accelerating down Magnolia Lane far faster than the posted speed limit, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of his epic misjudgment. Evelyn watched the cruiser disappear around the corner, the flashing lights extinguished, leaving the street seemingly peaceful once more. But the peace felt different, now tainted by the ugliness of the encounter. The adrenaline that had surged through her began to recede, leaving behind a familiar, bone-deep weariness. It was the exhaustion not just of the confrontation itself, but of the cumulative weight of countless similar moments, the constant vigilance required, the psychic toll of navigating a world that so often questioned her right to simply be. Mr. Henderson stepped closer, placing a comforting, slightly trembling hand on her shoulder. His face, usually placid and judicial, was etched with anger. "That was appalling, Evelyn," he said, his voice tight with indignation. "Completely unacceptable behavior from law enforcement. I saw the whole thing, heard most of it. If you need a witness for your complaint, and I strongly suggest you file one, you just say the word. I'll provide a full statement." Evelyn managed a small, grateful smile touched by his immediate support. "Thank you, George," she murmured, her voice slightly hoarse. "I appreciate that. I definitely will." She looked towards her house, the beautiful structure that was supposed to be her sanctuary, now feeling slightly less secure. The fight wasn't over. Filing the complaint, ensuring accountability, demanding change, that was the next necessary step. The resolve that had crystallized during the confrontation hadn't faded with the officer's departure. It had settled, deep within her, a hard certainty. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. Officer Miller's retreat was just the beginning. Stepping back inside her home felt like crossing a threshold into a different reality. The cool, conditioned air, scented faintly with lemon verbena from a discreet diffuser, enveloped her, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere outside. The minimalist elegance of her living space, the clean lines, the curated art, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a serene infinity pool and meticulously landscaped gardens, usually brought her a sense of calm and accomplishment. Today, however, the tranquility felt fragile, violated by the memory of Officer Miller's intrusive presence on her lawn, his prejudiced words echoing in the pristine silence. The sanctuary had been breached. Evelyn didn't pause to shower or change out of her running gear, though the damp fabric clung uncomfortably to her skin. The adrenaline still hummed beneath the surface weariness, fueling a focused, almost surgical anger. She walked directly to her home office, a sleek, modern room dominated by a large glass desk and ergonomic chair overlooking the back garden. Settling into the chair, she powered on her laptop, the quiet chime startlingly loud in the stillness. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, driven by a cold, precise fury. This wasn't just about venting frustration, it was about constructing an unassailable case. She began typing, her medical training influencing her approach, methodical, detailed, objective. She documented the exact time of the incident, pinpointing it using the digital clock on her running watch, 7:08 a.m. She specified the location, the public street, and then the private lawn directly in front of 42 Magnolia Lane. She recounted Officer Miller's words verbatim where possible, carefully noting the loaded phrases: suspicious activity, someone like you, casing properties, refusing to provide ID, despite her explanation. She detailed his demeanor, the initial aggressive posture, the condescending smirk, the invasion of her personal space, the ultimate disintegration when confronted with the truth. She included the crucial context, She was unarmed, wearing standard A jogging attire, engaged in a routine activity within yards of her own home. She noted the presence and names of witnesses. George Henderson, providing his address and phone number with his prior permission, and Mrs. Gable, noting her observation from her window. Most importantly, she explicitly referenced the existence of Officer Miller's bodycam footage, stating her firm expectation that it be preserved immediately and reviewed thoroughly as primary evidence corroborating her account. She knew the power of that digital witness, objective, unblinking, capturing nuance and tone in a way a written statement alone could not. Evelyn didn't merely describe the events, she framed them within the language of policy and law. She cited the relevant sections of the police department's own manual regarding bias-free policing, procedural justice, and the protocols for lawful stops and detentions. She articulated clearly how Officer Miller's actions constituted, in her view, racial profiling, unlawful detention, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Her tone was not emotional or accusatory in the typical sense. It was factual, analytical, presenting the evidence with the irrefutable logic of a medical diagnosis. It was the voice of someone accustomed to presenting complex information under scrutiny, someone whose credibility was already well established in her professional life. Once the detailed narrative was complete, she paused, reading it through, carefully ensuring every point was clear, every fact accurate. She then drafted a concise professional cover email. The subject line read, "Formal complaint regarding Officer Miller, badge number 714, incident on Magnolia Lane, date." She addressed it directly to the Chief of Police, whose email address she easily found on the city website. She meticulously added the commander of the Internal Affairs Division and the head of the Police Oversight Commission to the CC line. Then, making a calculated decision to apply external pressure from the outset, she added two more recipients, the Mayor's Chief of Staff and the President of the local NAACP chapter, a respected attorney she knew professionally. She hesitated, for only a moment before hitting send. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about Officer Miller. It was about the system that allowed his biases to operate unchecked. It was about ensuring that her status, her resources, which had ultimately shielded her from a worse outcome, were leveraged to potentially protect others who might not be so fortunate. Hitting send felt less like an act of anger and more like setting a carefully calibrated mechanism in motion. The email, landing with digital quietness in multiple high-level inboxes across the city, carried the weight of a formal indictment. It wasn't the rambling, emotional complaint they might sometimes receive. This was different. It came from a Dr. Evelyn Reed, a name that carried weight in the city's influential medical and social circles. It was detailed, specific, legally, informed, and explicitly referenced bodycam footage and credible witnesses. It couldn't be easily dismissed, filed away, or slow-walked through bureaucratic channels. It demanded immediate attention, and the inclusion of the Mayor's office and the NAACP ensured external scrutiny from the very beginning. Back in her quiet office, Evelyn finally allowed herself a long, slow exhale. The first critical step towards accountability had been taken. The digital witness was now officially summoned. The email from Dr. Evelyn Reed landed in Chief Harris's inbox at precisely 8:17 a.m., flagged as high importance by his administrative assistant almost immediately. Chief Harris, a veteran officer who had navigated the political minefield of his position for nearly a decade, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach even before opening it. Complaints weren't unusual, but the sender's name, Dr. Evelyn Reed, immediately set off alarm bells. He knew the name. She was a highly respected pediatric cardiologist at the city's main hospital, served on influential boards, and occasionally appeared in the society pages at major charity galas. This wasn't a routine disgruntled citizen. This was someone with credibility, connections, and likely the resources to pursue the matter vigorously. The CC list, including his Internal Affairs Commander, the Oversight Commission, the Mayor's Office, and the NAACP President, confirmed his unease. This wasn't just a complaint. It was a strategically deployed missile aimed squarely at his department's reputation. He clicked open the email, his expression grim as he scanned the meticulously detailed account. His eyes narrowed as he read Evelyn's recounting of Officer Miller's words, "Someone like you, casing properties." He noted the specific location right outside Dr. Reed's own multi-million-dollar home in Willow Creek Estates. He registered the mention of witnesses, particularly George Henderson, a retired judge whose reputation for integrity was unimpeachable. But the sentence that made his blood run cold was the explicit reference to the Bodycam footage. Insubordinate. Officers, citizen complaints, even occasional excessive force allegations were unfortunately part of the job. But documented, irrefutable evidence of blatant racial profiling against a prominent citizen captured on their own equipment. That was a public relations nightmare, a potential lawsuit, and a direct threat to the community trust he'd worked hard to cultivate. Before he even finished reading, Chief Harris was on the phone to Commander Davies in Internal Affairs. "Davies," he barked into the receiver, dispensing with pleasantries. "Did you see the Reed email?" "Just came in, Chief. Reading it now," Davies replied, his voice already laced with concern. "Miller involved, Willow Creek. Pull Miller's Bodycam footage from this morning. Priority 1, I want it reviewed within the hour," Harris ordered. "And get Miller off the street. Desk duty, effective immediately, pending investigation. No contact with the complainant or witnesses, understood?" "Understood, Chief, on it." Commander Davies hung up and immediately set the wheels of the internal affairs process in motion. An investigator was dispatched to retrieve the Bodycam unit from Officer Miller's assigned sector supervisor. Miller himself received a terse summons via radio to return to the precinct immediately, offering no explanation beyond "report to IA." The initial whispers began almost instantly among the dispatchers and officers monitoring the radio traffic. Miller was being pulled back, IA involved. Something serious had gone down. Within 45 minutes, the Bodycam footage was being reviewed in a small, sterile room in the Internal Affairs Unit. Investigator Thompson, a seasoned detective with a reputation for impartiality, watched the footage intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. The video quality was clear, the audio crisp. It captured everything Evelyn Reed had described, almost verbatim. Miller's initial approach, radiating suspicion, his condescending tone, the loaded questions, the "someone like you" remark delivered with casual arrogance. Evelyn's calm, measured responses, repeatedly stating she lived there, Miller's dismissal of her claims, his insistence on ID she clearly wouldn't have while jogging, his move to detain her. Then the stunning reversal, Evelyn's calm declaration of ownership, the opening gates, Miller's visible shock, panic, and disintegration, the intervention of Mr. Henderson, Miller's fumbling apology and hasty retreat. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation or benefit of the doubt. The footage didn't just corroborate Dr. Reed's complaint. It amplified it, showcasing Miller's bias and unprofessionalism in damning detail. Thompson made notes, time-stamping key moments, his face set in stony disapproval. He'd seen misconduct before, but the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of profiling someone on their own property, escalating the situation without cause, and getting caught so thoroughly on camera was staggering. Officer Miller arrived at IA looking pale and anxious. When confronted with the complaint and informed his Bodycam footage was being reviewed, his remaining bravado evaporated. His initial attempts to justify his actions, citing vague reports of suspicious activity, claiming he was just following procedure, sounded weak and unconvincing even to himself, especially knowing the camera told a different story. Investigator Thompson listened patiently, letting Miller dig his own hole before informing him he was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of the full investigation and disciplinary hearing. He was ordered to surrender his badge and service weapon. As Miller was escorted out of the IA unit, stripped of his authority, the news spread through the precinct like wildfire. Miller screwed up. Big time. Profiled Dr. Reed, the Dr. Reed. Right on her own front lawn. Got it all on Bodycam. Chiefs furious, mayor's office involved. NAACP watching. The incident wasn't just an internal matter anymore. It was rapidly becoming a departmental crisis, threatening to expose deeper issues of bias and accountability just beneath the surface of the city's polished image. The digital witness had spoken, and the unraveling had begun in earnest. News, especially news involving police activity and potential scandal, travels with astonishing speed through the interconnected, often insular, world of wealthy enclaves like Willow Creek Estates. The sight of the police cruiser blocking Magnolia Lane during the usually sacrosanct early morning hours hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Gable, despite her initial hesitant observation from behind her blinds, had certainly recounted the basics to her tennis group later that morning. Police talking to some jogger right outside Evelyn Reed's place looked quite intense. Mr. Henderson, more direct and far more indignant, had made calls to a couple of influential neighbors on the Homeowners Association board, expressing his disgust at the officer's conduct he'd personally witnessed. The story began to circulate, initially as fragments of neighborhood gossip, tinged with curiosity and perhaps a frisson of unwelcome disruption to their manicured peace. But when the official news filtered through later that day and into the next that the officer involved, Miller, had been immediately suspended pending investigation due to a formal complaint filed by Dr. Reed herself for racial profiling on her own property, the tone shifted dramatically. The fragmented gossip coalesced into a coherent, shocking narrative. It wasn't just some jogger, it was Dr. Reed, the respected cardiologist, their neighbor. It wasn't just intense talk, it was an alleged case of blatant bias-based harassment right here on Magnolia Lane. The swiftness of the officer's suspension lent immediate credibility to Evelyn's account, suggesting the evidence, likely the bodycam footage everyone now whispered about, was damning. The reaction within Willow Creek was complex, a mixture of genuine outrage, performative solidarity, and uncomfortable self-reflection. For some, like Mr. Henderson, the incident confirmed long-held concerns about pockets of prejudice within the local police force and reinforced their protective feelings towards Evelyn, whom they respected and liked. They saw it as an attack, not just on her, but on the values of fairness they believed their community should uphold. Their support was immediate, vocal, and unequivocal. For others, the reaction was more nuanced, perhaps tinged with a degree of cognitive dissonance. They knew Evelyn Reed, admired her professional accomplishments, appreciated the value her stunning home added to the neighborhood's prestige. The idea that she, their neighbor, could be subjected to such treatment was jarring. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about race and privilege that they might prefer to ignore. Their expressions of support, when offered, sometimes felt slightly awkward, as if grappling with the realization that the protective bubble of Willow Creek wasn't impermeable, especially not for everyone who lived within it. There was an undercurrent of "can you believe this happened here?" which subtly centered their own shock rather than Evelyn's experience. Then there were those, perhaps fewer but still present, whose silence was noticeable. Maybe they secretly sympathized with the officer's initial suspicion, their own biases whispering that perhaps Dr. Reed was an anomaly despite her address. Maybe they felt inconvenienced by the disruption, the unwelcome intrusion of real-world ugliness into their curated lives. Or maybe they simply preferred not to get involved, adhering to an unwritten code of quiet discretion common in such communities. Their averted gazes or abrupt changes of subject when the topic arose spoke volumes. Evelyn felt these shifting currents acutely in the days following the incident. Neighbors who had previously offered only a polite, almost imperceptible nod as she ran past, now made a point of stopping their cars or crossing their lawns to speak with her. The conversations were often brief, sometimes laced with an awkwardness born of confronting an uncomfortable reality. "Evelyn, I was so appalled to hear what happened," became a common refrain, usually followed by affirmations of her belonging, assurances that Officer Miller's actions didn't represent the community. Mrs. Gable, overcoming her initial reticence, appeared on Evelyn's doorstep one afternoon bearing a homemade apple pie, her face etched with genuine remorse. "I saw part of it from my window, Evelyn," she admitted, avoiding direct eye contact initially. "I should have come out. Said something. I froze. I'm truly sorry." Evelyn accepted the pie and the apology graciously, recognizing the effort. It likely took Mr. Henderson, true to his word, delivered a meticulously typed, signed and notarized statement detailing his eyewitness account, leaving it discreetly in her mailbox. Several other neighbors reached out via text or email, offering support, expressing outrage, and subtly signaling their alignment with her against the offending officer, and by extension, the system that enabled him. While appreciating the gestures, Evelyn couldn't entirely shake off a sense of weary cynicism. Would this outpouring have occurred if she weren't Dr. Evelyn Reed, owner of the house on Magnolia Lane? If she were a visitor, a nanny, a housekeeper of color experiencing the same treatment? Would the outrage be as swift, the support as readily offered? She suspected not. Her status, her undeniable belonging, backed by property deeds and professional accolades, had forced a confrontation with bias that might otherwise have been ignored or explained away. Yet the support, however complex its motivations, was still significant. The incident, intended to isolate and intimidate her, had inadvertently galvanized a segment of the community around her. It had peeled back the veneer of Willow Creek's perfect tranquility, revealing the fault lines of race and privilege beneath. The ripples spreading through the neighborhood weren't just gossip anymore. They were the beginnings of an uncomfortable, necessary conversation sparked by one officer's prejudice and one woman's refusal to be silenced on her own front lawn. A few days later, before the sun had fully climbed above the ancient oaks lining Willow Creek Parkway, Evelyn found herself standing before her closet, running shoes in hand. The routine felt different now, freighted with a significance it hadn't possessed before. The simple act of choosing her dry-fit tank and Lululemon shorts, lacing up her high-performance sneakers, it felt less like preparing for exercise and more like girding herself for a subtle form of battle, or perhaps a reaffirmation of her right to exist peacefully in this space. The memory of Officer Miller's cruiser blocking her path, his accusing eyes, his dismissive smirk. It was a fresh, raw wound. Part of her, the part exhausted by the constant vigilance, whispered the temptation to stay inside, to run on the bay. State-of-the-art treadmill in her home gym, to avoid the possibility of another confrontation, another questioning gaze. But another part, the part forged in the fires of overcoming obstacles her entire life, the part that had stared down prejudice and systemic barriers to reach the pinnacle of her profession, refused to yield. Giving up her run, altering her routine because of one biased officer's actions, felt like conceding defeat, like acknowledging that he had succeeded in making her feel unwelcome, unsafe, othered in her own sanctuary. It would be letting the ugliness win. And Evelyn Reed did not let ugliness win. Not in the operating room, and certainly not on her own street. So she laced up her shoes, the familiar ritual grounding her. She clipped the small pouch with her key fob to her waistband, a silent reminder of the tool that had ultimately dismantled Miller's assumptions. Taking a deep breath, she opened her front door and stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air. The world outside looked exactly the same, the manicured lawns still damp with dew, the sky beginning its slow transformation, from inky indigo to soft pearl grey, the scent of jasmine lingering sweetly. Yet she felt irrevocably altered. The naive sense of complete security she'd perhaps allowed herself to cultivate in this enclave was gone, replaced by a heightened awareness, a more realistic understanding of the invisible lines and biases that existed even here behind the gates and hedges. She began her run, her steps perhaps a fraction more deliberate, her stride imbued with a conscious defiance. As she moved along Magnolia Lane, past the darkened windows of houses where neighbors still slept, she felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and strength. She was aware, in a way she hadn't been before, of the potential scrutiny behind every curtain, the possibility of another misinterpretation, another challenge. Yet, counterintuitively, she also felt more grounded, more intensely present in her own skin. The confrontation had stripped away a layer of complacent comfort, but it had also reinforced her core identity, her resilience, her fundamental right to occupy this space without apology. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, dramatic shadows, the neighborhood slowly began to stir. She saw Mr. Henderson step out to retrieve his newspaper, offering her a warm, supportive wave and a thumbs up that felt like a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Mrs. Gable, backing out of her driveway again, stopped her car, rolled down the window and offered a genuine smile. "Good morning, Evelyn. Good to see you out." It was a small gesture but significant, a public alignment that countered the public humiliation she had endured just days before. Not all encounters were so positive. A man walking his Labrador further down the street, someone she didn't recognize, gave her a long, assessing look that felt uncomfortably similar to Miller's initial appraisal, though he said nothing. Another neighbor, someone she usually exchanged pleasantries with, seemed to suddenly become intensely focused on pruning his hedges as she approached, avoiding eye contact altogether. Evelyn registered these reactions, the subtle affirmations, and the lingering suspicions, acknowledging them without letting them derail her. She couldn't control how others perceived her, couldn't erase the biases ingrained in their minds. All she could control was her own response, to continue to exist, to take up space unapologetically. Her run became more than just physical exercise. It became a moving meditation on resilience, on the nature of belonging. Each footfall on the pavement felt like a quiet declaration. I am here. This is my home. I will not be intimidated. I will not shrink. The rhythm of her breathing, the burn in her muscles, the familiar landmarks of her route, they anchored her, reminding her of the strength within her own body, the discipline within her own mind. The incident hadn't broken her. It had, in a strange way, clarified her purpose. Not just as a doctor, but as a black woman navigating a world still rife with prejudice. It had reminded her that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply to continue living your life with your head held high, refusing to let ignorance dim your light or dictate your path. As she rounded the final corner, her own magnificent house coming into view, no police cruiser blocking the way, she felt not triumph, perhaps, but a quiet, profound sense of having reclaimed her sanctuary, step by determined step. The official letter confirming Officer Miller's termination arrived via certified mail, a crisp, impersonal document from the Chief of Police. For Evelyn, holding it felt less like closure and more like the final punctuation mark on a deeply unsettling chapter. There was no sense of triumph, only a somber acknowledgement of a necessary outcome. The system had, in this instance and under considerable pressure, corrected itself regarding one individual. But the larger questions about the attitudes and biases that allowed Miller to act with such impunity in the first place remained unanswered, hanging heavy in the air. Removing the symptom didn't automatically cure the disease. In the wake of the incident, the police department scrambled into damage control mode. Chief Harris, facing scrutiny from the mayor's office and pointed questions from the NAACP, announced a raft of new initiatives: mandatory enhanced anti-bias training, workshops on procedural justice, renewed commitments to community policing. Press releases were issued, touting transparency and accountability. Evelyn received formal, carefully worded letters of apology from both the chief and the mayor, expressing regret for her experience. She acknowledged them politely, accepting them as necessary institutional gestures, while privately reserving judgment on whether they represented genuine change or merely a temporary appeasement strategy. Real change, she knew, was measured, not in announcements, but in sustained action and altered behavior on the streets. Within Willow Creek Estates itself, the ripples continued to spread, disrupting the usually placid surface of neighborhood life. The hastily convened homeowners association meeting, prompted by Mr. Henderson's persistent advocacy, became an awkward forum for uncomfortable truths. While some residents clung defensively to the idea that Miller was just one bad apple, others bravely shared subtle experiences of exclusion or unease, hinting at underlying tensions previously kept hidden beneath the veneer of polite society. The conversation was stilted, perhaps, and certainly didn't resolve anything definitively, but the mere fact that it was happening felt significant. The invisible shield of complacency around the neighborhood had been pierced, forcing at least some residents to confront the reality that privilege didn't guarantee immunity from societal ills, especially for neighbors who didn't fit the presumed mold. For Evelyn, The internal landscape had shifted irrevocably. The easy comfort she once felt during her morning runs was replaced by a persistent, low-level hum of vigilance. Every passing car seemed to hold potential scrutiny. Every unfamiliar face prompted a flicker of caution. The sense of her home as an unbreachable sanctuary had been eroded, yet this new vulnerability coexisted with a sharpened sense of resolve. The incident hadn't just been an assault on her dignity. It had been a visceral reminder of the broader context of her existence as a black woman in America, even one who had achieved significant professional and financial success. This realization fueled a quiet transformation. She found herself engaging more assertively in discussions about equity and inclusion at the hospital, leveraging her position on various boards to push for meaningful change, not just platitudes. The anger, which still simmered beneath the surface, was channeled into focused advocacy. She understood now, more deeply than ever, that her personal experience was interwoven with a much larger narrative of struggle and resilience. Her stand, on her own lawn, initially an act of self-preservation and indignation, had inadvertently become a catalyst, however small, for broader conversations and a renewed sense of purpose within herself. She hadn't asked to be a symbol, but she wouldn't shy away from the responsibility that came with her story resonating beyond the confines of Magnolia Lane. The quiet clicking of her shoes on the pavement during her morning runs now sounded less like retreat and more like the steady beat of resistance. For those of us who've lived long enough to see both change and resistance, this story hits deeper because we know real progress is slow, it's costly, and it demands courage from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you've watched a loved one face injustice. Maybe you felt powerless in the face of it all. But this story shows power doesn't come from a badge or a title or even a bench. It comes from standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs